Maybe if you paid attention in film school, this studio wouldn't look like a crime scene. Stanley swore if Elena Monroe glared at him 1 second longer, his skin would melt off on the spot. The second she made that statement, the air went dead. The audience gasped in shock, faces froze, and somewhere deep down, everyone knew this was just the beginning of something incendiary. At this point, Stanley was begging the floor to swallow him immediately. It was 9:15 a.m., live television, the nation was watching. Elena Monroe, America's sweetheart, blonde, pristine, and utterly ruthless, smiled for the close-up, her insult still hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Behind camera 2, Stanley Carter felt the blood drain from his face. The lens, usually an extension of his own eye, suddenly felt like a shield he wanted to vanish behind. The entire crew was still in shock. Greg Tanner, Elena's co-host, offered a weak, nervous chuckle, the sound of a man too afraid to challenge the Queen. The segment mercifully cut to commercial. The awkward silence that followed was deafening. But that was not the first time Stanley would be humiliated today. 4 hours earlier. The knocking was sharp, insistent, pounding against the thin wood of apartment 2B like a judge's gavel. Stanley's heart hammered against his ribs. It was 4:30 a.m., the sky outside still a bruised purple. He was in the kitchen, carefully slicing strawberries for his daughter's lunch. A small luxury he could barely afford, but one he refused to sacrifice. Layla, his 7-year-old Jim, was still asleep. He opened the door. Mrs. Durrant stood there, wrapped in a faded floral housecoat, her face a road map of disapproval. His 58-year-old landlady, heavy-set, cranky, and proudly joyless, didn't wait for a greeting. "You still live here, Mr. Carter?" she growled. "Of course," Stanley replied. "You see, that's funny because you haven't paid the rent, so I wasn't sure." Mrs. Durrant gave him a death stare. "I'm not sure you realize how fast I can have all your things thrown out," she continued. "I know many tenants who would pay double in a heartbeat just to have this place." Stanley let out a heavy sigh of frustration. Getting threatened by his landlady on his 35th birthday was surely not on his bucket list. "I know, Mrs. Durrant. I told you I get paid on Friday." Stanley kept his voice low, a dignified rasp. "Friday was what you said last month," she retorted, her voice rising, cutting through the quiet hallway. "I want my money, not your promises. My patience is getting thinner than these walls." From the doorway of the bedroom, a small voice piped up. "Daddy? Who is it?" Layla stood there, rubbing her eyes, clutching her worn teddy bear. Mrs. Durrant looked past Stanley, her eyes sweeping over the cramped apartment. The peeling paint, the second-hand furniture, the undeniable scent of struggle. "It's nothing, sweetheart," Stanley said, trying to physically block Mrs. Durrant's judgmental gaze, but the landlady pressed forward. "It's not nothing. It's about responsibility. Something you folks seem to always struggle with." She looked back at Stanley, a cruel twist to her lips. "You have until next Monday, Mr. Carter. 1 week. Or you and your princess can find a new castle. This is your final warning." She turned and shuffled away. Stanley closed the door, leaning his forehead against the cool wood, breathing deeply. He could handle the disrespect aimed at him, but seeing that flicker of fear and confusion in Lila's eyes, that was a different kind of pain. What on earth made her think it was okay to say that in his daughter's presence? Perhaps he had exhausted every last strand of courtesy Mrs. Durrant had to offer. He turned, forcing a bright smile. "Hey, sunshine, ready for the best pancakes in the city?" He moved through the morning routine with practiced grace, ironing Layla's school uniform, braiding her hair, hiding the exhaustion behind a mask of paternal strength. He was a single father, a role he wore not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. When Layla was ready, he kissed her goodbye at the bus stop. "Be brilliant today, Layla." "Be brilliant, Daddy." He watched the bus pull away, the weight of the world settling back onto his shoulders. At home, he faced the devil. At work, the deep blue sea. He grabbed his camera bag, the strap patched multiple times with electrical tape, and headed for the subway, weary, broke, and holding on to the last frayed thread of his dignity. The Sunrise Central Studio was a monument to manufactured joy, bright colors, gleaming surfaces, and the overwhelming smell of hairspray and desperation. Stanley navigated the backstage chaos, a ghost in the machine. He saw Elena holding court near the craft services table. She was laughing, a sound like breaking glass, while a young production assistant nervously steamed her blazer. "Careful, darling," Elena purred, not looking at the assistant. "If you burn this, that's your 6-month salary on the line." Greg Tanner stood beside her, scrolling through his phone, nodding along. Greg was the human equivalent of beige wallpaper, inoffensive, unremarkable, and entirely complicit. He thrived by never contradicting Elena, a pilot fish swimming in the shark's wake. Stanley set up camera 2, his movements precise and economical. He knew the rhythms of the show, the angles that made Elena look ethereal, the lighting that softened Greg's weak chin. He was good at his job. He was excellent, in fact. But excellence didn't pay the rent. Today, he needed to ask for a salary advance. The thought alone made his palms sweat. He had been rehearsing the words in his mind all night, trying to find the right balance between professionalism and desperation. "Showtime in 5, the floor director yelled. The hosts took their seats, the transformation immediate. The cruel edges softened, the vacant eyes sparkled. They were professionals. The show began. The usual blend of celebrity gossip, cooking segments, and sanitized news. Stanley followed the action, but his mind was a chaotic swirl of eviction notices and Lila's worried face. He was preoccupied, distracted by the very real possibility of homelessness. It happened during the 9:15 a.m. Wellness Wednesday segment. A technical glitch, minor, usually manageable. The cue light on camera 1 had just misfired, and simultaneously, the teleprompter froze. Elena stumbled over a word, a microscopic crack in her perfect facade. She glared at the prompter, then at the floor director, her eyes searching for a target. Greg, sensing the shift in temperature, tried to cover. "Well, it seems our technology is taking a wellness day, too." But Elena wasn't playing. The frozen script, the misfired cue, the canceled guest an hour before airtime, it was all piling up. And Elena Monroe didn't do chaos. She turned her gaze directly toward camera 2, toward Stanley. He saw it coming before she even opened her mouth. The subtle tightening of her jaw, the predatory gleam in her eyes. He hadn't done anything wrong. The glitch was system-wide, but he was the easiest target, the one who couldn't fight back. "Well, Greg," she said, her voice dripping with sham sympathy. "It's hard to focus when the framing is so distracting." She paused for effect, the camera pushing in closer. "Maybe if our camera guy had paid attention in film school, this studio wouldn't look like a crime scene right now." It was meant to be another one of her mindless, haughty remarks, but this time everyone froze. It felt like a brutal attack, a public execution. Stanley felt the humiliation burn hot and deep. He thought he had messed up. He thought his preoccupation with the rent, with the salary advance, had caused him to lose focus and ruin the shot. He internalized the blame instantly. He had just given the shark a reason to bite him. When the commercial break hit, the floor director, pale and shaken, hissed, "What was that?" "Check your framing, Stanley." Stanley nodded mutely. He couldn't explain. He couldn't defend himself. He just stood there, the weight of the camera pressing down on him, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. He didn't know that the moment he was agonizing over was about to explode into a million pieces. The humiliation curdled in Stanley's stomach, turning into a cold, hard knot of panic. He escaped the studio floor during the next break, heading for the men's room on the executive floor, a quieter space where he hoped to regain his composure. He splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the pristine mirror. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He looked tired. He looked defeated. The panic attack was rising, his breath catching in his throat. He was going to be fired. He was going to be homeless. Layla! Frustration boiled over, erupting in a sudden bitter wave of mockery. He needed a release. He leaned closer to the mirror, adopting Elena's breathy, condescending tone. Good morning, America. Today we're talking about how avocado toast can save your soul. Because who cares about real problems when you can just print money? He straightened up, puffing out his chest, mimicking Greg's forced joviality. That's right, Elena. And later we'll have a dog who can play the piano. Riveting journalism. Absolutely riveting. He paced the tiled floor, the bitterness turning into a sharp, insightful critique. Look at us. We're so relatable. We understand the struggle even though our shoes cost more than your mortgage. Smile, smile. Don't let them see the emptiness inside. It was raw, scathing, and undeniably charismatic. What Stanley didn't realize was that he wasn't alone. In the last stall, hidden from view, Elvis Washington sat listening. He had come to the bathroom seeking a moment of quiet reflection after the chaos in the control room. He heard every word Stanley spat into the mirror. Elvis didn't move. He didn't cough. He didn't flush. He just listened. When Stanley finally ran out of steam, breathing heavily, he wiped his face with a paper towel and left the bathroom. A moment later, Elvis Washington emerged from the stall, his expression unreadable. If you're finding yourself completely hooked by Stanley's story and the sheer audacity of Elena Monroe, please take a moment to like this video and make sure you're subscribed. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to life. Now let's see what happens next on Stanley's timeline. The next morning, the atmosphere at Sunrise Central was like a funeral. The PR crisis had deepened overnight. 2 major sponsors had officially pulled their advertising. Stanley arrived at the studio, relieved that security hadn't accosted him at the entrance and escorted out of the building. He walked in with his head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The receptionist, a young and slender blonde who usually never looked up from her phone, stared at him with wide eyes. Mr. Carter? Stanley braced himself. Yes? Mr. Washington wants to see you. The executive boardroom, right now. Stanley's stomach plummeted. This was it. Being fired by the CEO himself. It was a strange kind of honor, he supposed. He took the elevator up to the top floor. The doors opened onto a corridor of plush carpets and expensive art. He felt entirely out of place. He entered the boardroom. It was a massive room dominated by a long, polished mahogany table. The entire executive board was present, along with Elena Monroe and Greg Tanner. Elena, seated at the head of the table, looked defiant, though there were faint stress lines around her eyes. Greg looked like he was about to be sick, and at the far end of the room, gazing out the window at the city skyline, stood Elvis Washington. Mr. Carter, please, sit down. One of the board members, a stern-looking man named Mr. Abernathy, gestured to a lone chair at the opposite end of the table. It felt less like a seat and more like an electric chair. Abernathy cleared his throat. We have a crisis. The incident yesterday has caused significant damage to the network's reputation. We need decisive action to control the narrative. He looked at Elena. Ms. Monroe's comments were regrettable. However, she is the face of Sunrise Central. Her brand equity is invaluable. He then looked at Stanley. Mr. Carter, we appreciate your service. However, Given the incompetence that led to these circumstances, we believe it's best for the show and for you to move on. A generous severance package will be provided, of course, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement. It was exactly what Stanley had feared. Quiet dismissal. Corporate cleanup. Elena smirked. It's for the best. Surely this PR nightmare will blow over. It always does. But I am still the face of the show, and the audience still loves me. I'm sorry it had to come to this, Stanley. The board members nodded in agreement. It was settled. But then Elvis Washington turned from the window where he had been busy on his phone. He walked slowly to the table. The room fell silent. It's interesting, Elena, that you speak of what the audience loves, Elvis said, his voice calm, almost conversational, because I was curious about that myself. He opened a thin file folder and slid a document across the table. Last night I got a few disturbing messages. A lot, actually. And that prompted me to launch a viewer poll on the network's official social media pages. A simple question. Who do you want to see on Sunrise Central? He paused, letting the anticipation build. The results are illuminating. He pointed to the document. 81% of viewers voted for Stanley Carter to take the stage. 19% voted to keep Elena Monroe. The room gasped. Elena stared at the paper as if it were written in an alien language. That's impossible. Surely you don't buy this frivolous online hysteria. Elvis's voice lowered. Usually I don't. But as it turns out, someone made a clip of your outburst and posted it online, and here's what the caption said. Elvis reached for his laptop, pressed a few buttons, and read out loud like he was a presenter himself. Elena Monroe just spat in the face of one of the hardest working men in this building. Stanley Carter is a single dad of a 7-year-old daughter who shows up every day, treats everyone with respect, and makes this show look good. This is disgusting. Hashtag Justice for Stanley. Elena froze. What the hell is that? Elvis narrowed his gaze at Elena. Apparently one of your staff was just blowing off steam, but that steam is blowing up on the internet. He turned his laptop towards her and the rest of the room. Miss Monroe. Elvis collapsed back into his seat. Under normal circumstances, I'd look the other way, but this hashtag has just had over 10,000 tweets in the past 2 hours. 10,000. He paused as the board reacted with low gasps and whispers. Some began to scroll through their phones to confirm what Elvis had said. None of them were more shocked than Elena. I've just spoken with my PR people and sponsors, and with the rate at which this underdog narrative is going, we can't afford to not be proactive. Elena sprung up from her seat as if she had just sat on a needle. What do you mean by proactive? She didn't like where this was going. Stanley just stood there and observed. Some part of him still wondered why he was still in the room. What was he waiting for? Closure? Elvis spoke up. Well, this trend has given us a window of opportunity to restructure the show. The internet loves an underdog story, and with the facts on ground, we have no choice but to give it to them. What facts? What is the meaning of this, Elvis? Elena protested with a cracked voice. Elvis began pulling out documents, spreading them across the mahogany table as they slid towards the proximity of different board members. These are HR complaint reports. Makeup artists, interns, producers, sound engineers, all detailing a pattern of behavior. Toxic, humiliating, abusive behavior. He looked directly at Elena. Dating back 7 years. He read a few snippets aloud. Insults about weight, comments about intelligence, threats of career destruction. The pattern was undeniable. Turns out, Elvis said softly, Stanley's moment wasn't the first time you crossed the line, just the first one caught on camera. Elena's confidence cracked. The mask slipped, revealing the fear beneath. Elvis, you can't do this. I built this show. Greg, seeing his career flashing before his eyes, finally found his voice. Mr. Washington, If Elena is stepping down, then I would be happy to help the network save face as the new host. I have the experience. I've co-hosted for 5 years, and I know how to get the job done." Elena turned slowly, a look of betrayal strewn across her face. But Greg didn't care. He wasn't even looking at her. Elvis turned his gaze to Greg. "I'm sure you'll do okay, but we are not moving in that direction either." He turned to Stanley, who had been watching the entire scene unfold in stunned silence. "Mr. Carter," Elvis said, "yesterday, I happened to overhear you in the men's room." Stanley's heart stopped. The mimicry, the mockery. He was ruined. "You were venting," Elvis continued. "You were mocking the show." The board members looked confused. Stanley froze. He didn't know he was being watched. Now he was trying to find the words to defend himself, but then he realized he had already been fired, and any other thing he attempted to say might just make things worse for him. All he could think of right now was Layla. "But that's not what I heard, Mr. Carter," Elvis said, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "I heard honesty. I heard sharpness. I heard a man who sees the world not through a realistic lens. I heard raw charisma." He addressed the board. "Mr. Carter here has what you all pretend to have, raw authenticity." Elena's face had turned crimson. Now she was furious. "Authenticity? He's a cameraman. You're going to hand the keys to a multi-million-dollar show to a nobody? Elvis, I am the show." Elvis looked at her, his expression cold and final. "No, Miss Monroe. The show is whatever the viewers want to see, and right now, they believe Stanley is in the best position to give that to us." Stanley had never looked so confused in his entire life. Was this some pre-planned birthday prank or what? Elvis turned to the board. "The situation is clear. Ms. Monroe has created a legal and a PR liability that we can no longer ignore. The audience hasn't just turned on her, they have declared solidarity with Mr. Carter." He leaned his hands against the posh mahogany table. "If we fire Stanley and keep Elena, we confirm every accusation of corporate indifference. We will risk losing our remaining sponsors and alienate what now seems to be 81% of our audience. But if we embrace this change, if we put Stanley front and center, we don't just control the damage, we redefine the narrative. We become the network that listens, the network that values authenticity over ego." The board, seeing the statistics, the legal threats, and the undeniable logic, reluctantly agreed with incoherent murmurs. Elvis walked over to Stanley. "Mr. Carter, I'm offering you a chance, a one-time opportunity, a new segment starting next Monday. We'll call it something along the lines of..." He paused, turning his gaze towards the glass window for inspiration. "How about Behind the Lens, a fresh start? The chair is yours now, Mr. Carter. Do you want it?" Stanley looked at the faces around the room, the stunned executives, the humiliated Greg, the furious Elena. He thought of Layla. He thought of Mrs. Durrant. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly, and met Elvis Washington's gaze. "Yes, I do." The following week felt like a fever dream. Elena Monroe, facing mounting public pressure and the threat of lawsuits, resigned from the network. Greg Tanner was relegated to the weekend weather segment, fading quickly into obscurity. Stanley was thrust into a whirlwind of wardrobe fittings, rehearsals, and media training, but Elvis insisted that the training be minimal. "I hired you for your voice and your spontaneity," he said. "Don't let them polish it away." Monday morning, 8 a.m. Stanley sat in Elena's old chair. The studio lights felt different from this side. He was nervous, his heart pounding, a dry throat. The camera's red light blinked on. The familiar Sunrise Central theme music played. But it felt different now, fresher. Stanley looked directly into the lens, the same lens he had hidden behind for years. He took a deep breath. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady, warm, and genuine. "And yes, I'm that Stanley." In the control room, the crew erupted in applause. Across the country, audiences leaned in. Elvis's assessment was right. The ratings improved drastically. The audience had now tripled. Everyone wanted to know what all the fuss was about, who Stanley was, and whether Elena's outburst was justified or not. This new wave of audience brought back old sponsors and attracted new ones to the network. One of the first things Stanley did that very day was to talk to Elvis about his rent situation, which was instantly resolved. Elvis offered him a huge starting bonus on his new position that very day, huge enough to shut up his landlady for the rest of the year. The following Monday, Stanley stood outside apartment 2B. It was 4:30 p.m. He knocked on the door. Mrs. Durrant opened it, her face already twisting into a scowl. "Mr. Carter, I told you—" She stopped. Stanley was holding a cashier's check. He handed it to her. "This is for the back rent," he said calmly, "and the next 6 months in advance." Mrs. Durrant stared at the check, speechless. The amount was staggering. Stanley reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He offered it to her. "And this," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "This is for the delay." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, mouth agape. He opened the door to his apartment. Layla was at the kitchen table drawing. She looked up, her face bright. "Daddy! Come and see my giraffe! Come and see!" He hugged her tight. The apartment still had peeling paint and secondhand furniture, but it felt different now. It felt secure. That day, Stanley had closed his broadcast, looking directly into the camera, his face calm, confident, and finally at peace. We spend so much of our lives observing, watching others live out their dreams, feeling invisible in the background. But sometimes life doesn't put you behind the camera to punish you. It puts you there to prepare you for when it finally turns your way. Good night, everyone. The outro music played. The camera held on Stanley's face for one extra beat, long enough to see the quiet peace in his eyes, the kind of peace that only comes after surviving something you thought would destroy you. In living rooms across the country, people exhaled. Some wiped their eyes, others reached for their phones, already typing messages to people they'd been afraid to confront. Because Stanley's story wasn't just about a cameraman who became a host. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every parent who's worked 3 jobs and still felt like a failure. Every moment you stood in front of someone with power and felt your voice disappear. If this story reminded you that your dignity is worth fighting for, that the people who try to make you small are usually the ones most afraid of your light, then hit that subscribe button. Not for me. For the next Stanley who needs to know their story matters. Have you ever had someone try to humiliate you in public, and years later you finally found the words you wish you'd said in that moment? What would you tell them now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And who knows? Maybe your story is the one someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for watching our stories. And remember what Stanley told his daughter. Always be brilliant. Because somewhere out there, another hero is getting ready to arise, and their story deserves to be heard.